Hi, I'm Mike Bush.
I'm Paul New.
And I'm Colleen Sterling. Welcome to Ask the A&Ps from AOPA. So we're recording this after returning and surviving AirVenture.
Oh,
And
the
we have
Fisk
some
survival
stories.
arrival.
Yeah, I want a t-shirt that says, I survived the Fisk arrival.
Yeah,
We could
Yeah,
probably sell
th-
thousands.
this year was a little unusual. Colleen and her husband Dave flew with me in my Cessna 310, and for the last 25 years, I have always made an IFR arrival reservation because doing the Fisk arrival in a airplane that's hard to slow down is a bit scary. And I actually lost a friend 25 years ago who had a fast glass air that ATC stuck behind something slow and asked him to slow down, make S turns, and he wound up stalling and died. So ever since then, I've been coming in IFR, and they only have 4 IFR arrival slots per hour, and so it's always a challenge to get them. But I've always been successful in nabbing a IFR arrival reservation, and except for this year, I spent something like 4 hours online trying to get an IFR arrival slot without success. So we wound up making the dreaded Fisk arrival.
And thank God for ForeFlight.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
and
it was.
ADSB.
Well, I would not
wow.
have wanted to do it without 3 pilots in the cockpit.
And then 3 copies of the NOTAM and
We
2
had an
free
amazing
tablets.
amount of information at our disposal that we never would have had before. We could
Yeah.
see everybody on
And we
our
only
iPads.
we only got spun out once because runway 36 was closed due to an incident. So we only got to see Fisk twice on the approach.
Yeah, they sent us back to Endeavor, which
Yeah.
is what, that's
47 miles from us.
47 miles.
Yes.
So and in we loaded up with a lot of fuel because we knew anything can happen going into Oshkosh via the Fisk arrival. So it was a good thing we did because we were not worried about fuel. It was a 2-hour flight from Sioux Falls, and we had 6.5 hours of fuel. So
Yeah. I fortunately had a friend, Chris, riding along with me, which was hugely helpful. I was planning to go into Fond du Lac just because it's so much easier, so much less traffic. And as we got close, we thought, the conga line doesn't look too overwhelming. Let's give it a try. And we got in at Endeavor. We got to the second waypoint, and 3 airplanes ahead of us decided that 90 knots was not the right speed. They liked 70 knots.
yeah,
So I'm flying the Cirrus at 68 to 70 knots, thinking this is not smart. This is just not smart. And I mean, it was in control, but boy, that was just a lot of stress. And so
Yeah.
next year, people, 90 knots. It's like 90. If you're in the J3 Cub, it's like firewall.
They're
Firewall
pedaling
that
as fast
thing.
as they can.
that's the
Wow.
problem. We came in at the higher altitude, so we were maintaining 135 knots.
It was more civilized up there.
But it's it's a real challenge for the controllers because at the last minute they have to merge the fast guys with the slow guys, and it can get interesting.
So yeah, that was the thing. So several years ago, several times I came in a Navajo. So I came in the high arrival, the faster arrival. So this year I'm playing by the rules. I'm doing 90 knots, and a couple of Bonanzas and something else came in the high side, and I'm like, that's
Uh-huh.
not what it's supposed to be. And the controllers let them in, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking, okay, are we encouraging bad behavior, or should I just pull up and forget this 70 knot stuff, and I can do 135 knots? That's not a problem. Anyway,
Well,
that
in
was a
their
little
defense,
frustrating.
I thought the Fisk controllers were exceptional.
Hats
Oh,
off.
There was
no.
particularly one of them who obviously was a pilot and was saying all the right things. This is when 3.6 was closed and they were sending lots of people back around to Endeavor, and he was saying, "Hey guys, check your fuel. We don't have an air show today." This was Sunday that we arrived. So, we have plenty of time to get you all in. If you need to go, to Fond du Lac or something and get some fuel, you can come on back and we'll get you in. Don't worry about it.
He
He
had a
was
good sense of
very,
humor.
very reassuring.
There
Yeah.
was absolutely no complaint about the controllers. It wasn't on them. It was mostly on the people that decided just on a whim that, they had to go in the high side because it looked faster. It was
Yeah.
mostly the people arriving, not the controllers. One controller though, some guy, it was the same end number. I won't say the end number, but I'll forever remember it. He got turned out as it ended with an X-ray. He got turned out for the second time, and one of the controllers says, "We've been calling your number a lot today, haven't we?"
Yeah, they had a good sense of humor there.
Yeah,
Hey,
they had a good sense of
careful,
humor.
Paul. My aircraft ends in an X-ray.
That's true. It
That
wasn't
wasn't you,
you.
though.
It wasn't you. As well after you guys had arrived.
And now I know a bucket list thing for me is to go out to Fisk with a little cooler and a lawn chair and just watch those guys in action, because I hear it's very entertaining.
I bet it would be. Yeah.
People don't know that you can do that. So
Yeah, we used to do that back in the day when I exhibited there and came several days early. That's a fascinating thing to do. By the way, I don't do that anymore. I arrive on Sunday, but
We'll have to
if
try
you
that.
if you go there a few days early, the place is empty, and then you kind of watch it over a few days just go from acres and acres of nothing to acres and acres of, oh my God.
Yeah.
now we watch that on the webcam. We're
Yeah,
always
yeah,
checking the
there you go.
webcams and remarking how quickly it fills up.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I just have to remind you about how my Oshkosh started Monday morning.
Oh, jeez.
I,
We keep
I've
hearing
never
the
even
same
sat in a
story.
P-51, and I got an awesome ride flying formation in the P-51. It's just one of those things,
You
you
just
can't
got
not
to ride
talk about.
because you're cute, Paul. That's
You're
just going around
right.
being cute.
That's it. No, I have this forlorn look. This, this like, someone please take care of me. Kind
How
of look.
did you score this P-51 ride? Did
The
you win
somebody.
a raffle or
Yeah.
something?
The friend that came up with me used to do, or still does, a lot of work with the Warbird folks. Actually stayed in that area. So he's all up on who's got an open seat and who doesn't. And when there's an open seat, they're often very happy to take someone along for the ride. And my pilot was just phenomenal. No flight controls in the back seat, and in a bad
A
situation.
good thing too.
It was it would have been bad had there been any sort of emergency, because getting out of the back seat is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing ride.
Some people pay a lot of money for that, Paul.
I would have paid a
Yeah.
lot of good money for that. I
Yeah.
definitely would have.
Yeah, he's got some good pictures too.
I have to
Oh, yeah.
confess, I've been offered a P-51 ride a couple times, and I've always turned it down. It scares me.
Oh man,
I'm just a big chicken. I'm obviously the chicken of the group.
Chicken of the group.
Cluck,
Chicken of the
cluck,
group.
On that note,
On that note,
our first question is from Walt, who's wondering if some overzealous hammering on his airplane is causing cylinder issues. Go ahead, Walt. That sounds ominous.
yeah, not a good sign.
Yeah, so in the last 4 years, we've replaced 3 cylinders on the Seneca. So this is the TSIO 360 KBs. And the last 2 times, we sent the cylinders out because of the logistics issues and long delay on getting replacement cylinders to have them repaired. And both times, those last 2 times, they could not repair them because there were cracks. And I asked for the cylinders to be sent back. I wanted to see where the cracks were. Wasn't possible, couldn't do it. It's like, okay, well, we'll do what we got to do. So first I want to thank you all for, especially Mike, the lapping procedure video you did. We used that to extend the life of my number 5 cylinder 120 hours. did 2 lappings on that exhaust valve before we finally did replace it. So I appreciate that.
Well,
Kept us
what-
airworthy.
Out of
kept us airborne
curiosity,
pretty good.
why were all these cylinders replaced? What was the reason?
Well, only there was a poor compression on the one time. We had exhaust valve 2 times, but we had done the lapping on this number 5. We had not tried that on the other ones because we hadn't discovered your process or weren't familiar with it. I've now introduced 3 different mechanics to it, so we're spreading the good news. And one of these days, Paul, I'm going to come down and see you about the wonderful compression or oil control ring wash.
Okay.
Ring wash.
I've got a present.
Ring
for you.
wash. You got a present for it. Oh,
I know it.
I don't know that sounds good or not, unless it's cookies.
No, it's good stuff. But anyway, back to the challenge. So we finally had to replace this cylinder, and it was time. And so we removed it. And as I was there for my first time watching the cylinder removal, I made sure I was there for this. Wanted to see how this all worked. Very alert to some of the challenges there. And after removing all the accessories and plates and guides around this, a lot going on there in that engine, the mechanic proceeded to drop the exhaust manifold, taking all the exhaust bolts off on the odd side of this one engine. And then it didn't clear the exhaust bolts. And there is a slip joint on the exhaust manifold just downstream. And he was expecting that to rotate, and it didn't. So he grabbed a stick and a hammer, and he began to bang away at the top of the flange to try to clear the exhaust, and it didn't move. So he said, "Will you push on this while I'm hammering?" I'm like, this just doesn't seem like this should be necessary. And then that cylinder was removed eventually. But I said, well, let's loosen up the turbo clamp. The wonderful AD applies to those now. So we loosened the turbo clamp. It then pivoted on that clamp enough to get it off, and we did the cylinder replacement. So that was all good. Sent that cylinder out for repair. I wanted to have a spare. And same deal, it's cracked. I'm thinking, okay, now this is odd, and I'm wondering. My question comes, is it okay to hammer on an exhaust? It seems like it should drop, and my preference would have been to remove from the opposite side, the even side, the bolts as well, so the whole thing would come down, even if it wouldn't rotate properly. So that was the impetus of my question, which was, when is it okay to start wailing away on an exhaust system? It doesn't seem like it should be necessary. And tapping is one thing. I understand sometimes exhaust gaskets get seized up and all, but this was down a good 3/8 of an inch, half an inch before they started hammering. And the second part of the question is, when we first got the airplane several years ago, the exhaust was frozen up at the slip joints, and so we sent it out and had it overhauled. And then they put some ANTs on the joint when they reassembled it. And I said, well, doesn't it make sense to do this every time? Anytime we have an annual, let's take the exhaust apart and put ANTs. And the mechanic said, well, we'll lubricate it each time. And I don't think they're actually taking it apart. I haven't been there for every time and lubricating it. They're spraying something. But I understand that there's nothing you can spray in that won't cause more problems than it solves, because it won't handle the 1,000 degrees that happen around these turbochargers. So your opinion on both of those topics?
Well, the first thing, did you ever find out where the cracks were on the cylinders?
No.
Well, I can't imagine what you could possibly do to the exhaust to cause a crack on a cylinder.
Yeah.
I just don't see the two related. Worst case,
I'd be worried about
If-
the exhaust being
exhaust.
dented or something.
yeah,
Or a
it's
flange.
the exhaust is what I'd be worried about. Now, it might be possible if you're pulling down the odd cylinder side exhaust, you've got a pretty large or long
Side
lever
load,
arm
Yeah.
to put some bending load on the exhaust studs. Those aren't bolts, they're actually studs with nuts. And maybe you could bend a stud, or maybe you could crack something at the stud boss. I've never seen that. So I don't see any cylinder related issues with wailing away at the exhaust.
Especially if you're using a piece of wood. I've seen people use
Yeah.
a piece of wood to try to soften that. That's
Yeah.
definitely the way to go.
Now,
I mean, my reaction is, whoever it is you're sending the cylinders to is one of these zero tolerance shops that never saw a cylinder that they liked. So maybe you should be
Or-
sending cylinders to some other shop that's a little
Or
more
get a second
cooperative.
opinion.
Yeah. Or never
I
saw
mean,
a cylinder that wasn't
Like you
cracked.
tried.
Almost every cylinder that's been in service for a while is going to have cracks in the exhaust port, but I've never heard of any of them causing any problem.
And usually they're cracks in the spark plug area that
Yeah.
condemn a cylinder.
And I've never
But-
seen those
so-
cause any problems either. If they're,
Mike,
if
you're
they're-
saying cracks in the exhaust ports is acceptable to some extent?
I didn't say that.
Okay.
I
thought
said
I heard you
I've
say
never
that.
seen them cause any problem.
Right.
Acceptable is in the eye of the clearly nothing is acceptable.
Wanted to
as
clarify
guys
that for our
with cylinders.
listeners.
But
Okay.
this kind of brings up why we don't like to pull cylinders.
Yeah.
First of all, if you pull a cylinder, there's always a chance it's going to get condemned. But worse, anytime you pull cylinders, it gives the A&P an opportunity to stick his head in the hole and look around inside the engine, and maybe he'll find something he doesn't like, and then it'll turn into a debacle. And we don't like to do that, So we do everything we can to remediate cylinder problems without cylinder removal if it's possible.
And you can break a stud so easily
Oh,
doing
yeah.
this because
And-
a nut gets frozen on it, and then your life
Well,
becomes miserable.
the old-fashioned cylinders, the studs were easy to replace. Are they still using Roseanne studs now on Continental cylinders?
Yeah, we see 'em.
Those are
Well,
a royal pain. If one of those breaks,
you got troubles.
yeah.
The thing that really I'm a little concerned about, you're talking about taking the exhaust down every 100 hours or at every annual. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that's a lot to pull that down and make sure it's all
Yeah.
good. And when the exhaust freezes, when the slip joints freeze together, and now I don't have any data for this, so pardon me, everybody, for saying something without data. But if it sticks together, that implies to me that it wasn't moving in the first place, because every time you run an engine, if you look at like a Navajo exhaust or a Turbo Saratoga exhaust, those slip joints move. Oh, they'll open and close up to 3/4 of an inch. It's massive.
And you can see the marks on them.
You can see the
travel.
marks, and it happens every time you run the engine. If yours are sticking, that just tells me that they're not moving when they get hot. If they were moving when they got hot, they just wouldn't stick. So I don't know that any terrible thing has happened. Yours were stuck, but was anything else wrong?
Well, we did see some leaking on the number one exhaust port.
Well, but that's at the cylinder.
Right, that's at the cylinder.
And that's
Yeah.
not due to the slip joint sticking. That's due to the torque on the nuts being down.
Or the gasket being.
Or the gasket being, you got a
Yeah.
no blow gasket. What we find usually is that those nuts on the exhaust studs become untorqued. And so it's not a bad idea to go around at annual and just put a torque wrench on them, just make sure they're all back up to torque. And watch for leaks. Leaks are your indication that something's wrong. I like Mike with pulling cylinders. You start taking exhaust systems apart. You talked about the V-band clamp. I think the major reason why the V-band clamps crack is because people don't install them properly. They
don't torque them right.
they don't
Torque
torque
too
them
much.
right. Yeah, they over torque them to get them to clamp, and then they untorque it and then bring it up to the 30 inch pounds or whatever. And you're just asking for trouble, and I don't know that there's trouble there to be fixed. That's what I'm saying.
This is a matter of philosophy, Walt, and it sounded to me like you were espousing sort of a maximalist philosophy. Let's drop both sides of the exhaust to pull one cylinder. Let's take the exhaust apart every year to put anti-seize on
Because
it.
he didn't like the hammer attacking his
it-
air.
Right.
Well,
I get the hammer.
I'd rather do the hammer. First of all, I'd rather not pull a cylinder, which would mean I wouldn't even need to drop the exhaust. But
Right.
it's, again, we don't like to take stuff apart that you don't have to. And
Is there a way to lubricate these slip joints without disassembling them? And
No,
what material?
they're tight fit. I mean,
What do you use to lubricate them? What would you recommend, Paul?
well, the only way I know to lubricate them is to disassemble, clean them up, wire brush, all that sort of thing, get it down to nice clean metal, re-lubricate it with the proper anti-seize and slide it back together.
Yeah, high temp nickel anti-seize.
Nickel
And how
anti-seize.
often would you be doing this?
I wouldn't do it unless I saw an indication it needed it.
On condition.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If
Okay.
it's not leaking, and the general test, and this, you have to check your service manual. So this is not an every airplane test.
Right.
Pressurize the exhaust system, go around squirting with soapy water. Slip joints and couplings will often have bubbles. Bubbles are not a big deal. If it blows enough that you can't make bubbles, it's just blowing the soapy water off, now you've got an issue. So as a general rule of thumb, if it's just making bubbles, not real worried about it.
yeah. Also, the exhaust systems, when you're doing a pressure test cold, will often leak at joints that tighten up when the system is hot, so that it's an artifact of the pressure test. It's not something that's really causing problems when the engine is running. But we
Does
don't
that
like
help?
to take stuff apart.
Does that help? I know it doesn't
Yeah,
help you.
I just want to make
Walt,
sure we are taking stuff apart in the correct way and not adding stress. And again, I'm
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
maximalist, Mike. I do follow only on condition as little as necessary.
Yeah.
But if it was something that was a longer term, and I do think that the mechanics were lubricating in between, but I think it was actually because they were using a spray lubricant, it was more removing.
That's probably not going to get in there.
Yeah.
Something they're trying to get
Not
it to
in a slip
penetrate.
joint. Yeah, they were
Yeah.
hoping it would, because the spray loops, I know what they're talking about, are much more viscous. It's not a grease; it's a liquid, and they were hoping it would
seeps
get in there. It's not going to hurt anything.
Yeah.
And the hammer action, I mean, I wasn't there, so I don't know how aggressive.
It kind of depends
everything
on
was.
what they're banging on too.
Yeah.
They don't want to bang on something that's going to dent.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But if
It was on the exhaust flange itself, so it was.
Yeah, that's
Well,
that's not going
on
to
the
hurt
pilot.
anything.
It's not going to crack the cylinder.
I like my mechanics, so I'm glad they're
Good,
doing
yeah.
it right.
There you go.
Yeah. I guess there are some times when a hammer is appropriate for the airplane, but usually
Yeah.
if you have a piece of wood, that definitely is going to help soften
Yeah.
the blow.
If your starter won't turn, a hammer's a great thing to have.
Or your solenoid, yeah.
But Walt, stop pulling cylinders like that.
Well, we almost called you because we had done the valve grinding on that one twice, the lapping, and it was working really well. But then
And
the mechanic
one
was
of the
concerned about how much play we now had in the actual valve guide. We couldn't find any specs from Continental like Homing has tests.
No.
Yeah,
No.
it's interesting about that. First of all, I learned sort of the hard way that that the impulse when you first start lapping valves is not to do it nearly aggressively enough.
Yeah.
And I made that mistake the first time I did it. That I lapped the valve and it fixed the compression, but it didn't really make the valve look symmetrical when I bore scoped it at follow up. And I talked to my colleague Dave Pasquale, who's probably lapped more valves than anybody in the world, and he said, "Oh, you didn't do it aggressively enough." So I went back and I lapped it again. I lapped it much more aggressively this time, and then the valve returned to normal, and then a year later it was still beautiful. So, and the other thing about sloppy fit of a valve in a valve guide, that's fairly important in a Lycoming engine. It's not very important in a Continental engine, and the reason it's not important in the Continental engine is because Continentals don't have those sodium-filled exhaust valves, and so the Continental valves shed almost all of their heat, something like 80% of their heat, through the seat, not through the stem. In Lycoming, a lot of the heat is transferred through the stem, so a fairly snug fit of the stem in the guide is important to provide the heat transfer path. In Continentals, the valves can get amazingly sloppy, and you watch them under the borescope, and they hit the seat and they sidestep about a 1/16 of an inch, and it doesn't impair the operation at all. It's fine. as long as the valves are rotating, as long as the rotocoil doesn't fail. And we typically replace the rotocoils just routinely anytime we lap a valve, just
They're
because
cheap.
they're cheap and the valve train's already been taken apart. You might as well just put a new one in there because they wear and they stop working. And when they stop working, the valve stops rotating and then it develops a hot spot.
Very good.
Well, I mean, great questions, Walt. Sorry for all the cracks in your cylinders. That must be very
Alleged
frustrating.
cracks.
Alleged
Well,
cracks.
yeah.
And
There
next
you
time,
go.
the next cylinders you take off.
Ask him to
inappropriately-
dye pen them and send you pictures.
We need
Yeah.
a body.
Right?
Yeah, the
We
next
need-
time before you send them in, say, by the way, when you get these, I want
Yeah.
to see the report in pictures.
Yeah.
Or just go up there with them.
Or go up there with them, even better.
Yeah.
Or do an inspection after you pull them off. Or actually, just avoid the whole thing and don't pull
Don't
them
click them
off.
off.
Don't pull
Yeah.
a cylinder, right?
Yeah.
Very good.
Well, hopefully it won't happen again.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Anyway, thank you for your
All right,
question.
Walt.
Nice talking with you.
See you.
Yeah, that's good.
See ya.
Our next question is from Tim, who thinks his tach is tricking him. Go ahead, Tim.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I have a 1968 Cardinal that has been a victim of the savvy breakdown, which you guys did a wonderful job of, and the write-up was the names were changed to protect the innocent, which I appreciate.
Oh, I think I
But,
know which one this is.
Yeah,
Not
the
a
stuck valve.
victim.
Yeah,
It was
well,
a customer.
yeah. You guys
Yeah.
really helped me on. I very much appreciate that because we were stuck on the road, and of course, the first thing the shop says, we got to pull the engine, and I go like, no, hold on. So moving on,
Great.
same airplane. So it's a 68 Cardinal O360. It's the conversion, and I was out. Well, this has been a lingering question for quite some time, but I checked the tach, and there are a bunch of apps on your phone. One does a visual or optical, so you can hold it up on your instrument panel and it looks forward and looks at the RPM of the blinking of the blade and gives you a readout of RPM. And then there's also an audio one that, interestingly enough, you just program in. It's a 4-cycle engine and 4 cylinders, and it will listen through the microphone on your device and find out and give you a readout of RPM. And both of them are probably within 10 to 15 RPM of each other, which is just amazing for me.
Yeah.
And so red line on this airplane is 2,700 RPM. We have a climb propeller on the airplane. And so at doing a mag check, I'll do a run up to 1,800 and I'll compare it. And between these optical, audio, and then the mechanical, and there'll be a discrepancy where the onboard mechanical is reading maybe 50 RPM low, something like that. At cruise power up 2,500 RPM, it's reading a full 50 to 75 RPM. And then because of the climb prop, I actually run into red line at 2,700 RPM at about 75% power with the airplane when I'm up at altitude. And so if I run it right at 2,700 RPM, 75% power, it's reading a full 75 RPM low based on the optical and audio tach. And of course, short of, replacing it, I was wondering if there's an adjustment on the tach itself that you could go in, an A&P could go in and adjust it. I suppose pulling the cable out, relubing that would probably be the first step to troubleshoot it. But over to you for comment.
I would say the first step is to put a horizon tack or something in there and get rid of that
He's
old boat
trying
anchor.
to avoid doing that. It's a
Those
classic
things-
Cardinal. He wants the
those
classic
things are-
instruments.
Those things are just notoriously inaccurate,
Really? Oh, I've had experience
and they
with,
almost always read low when
with
they.
a tach cable
bad.
going bad, and literally the cable just spins in a sheath, and I would suspect if there's any friction in there, but I don't know if you can lubricate it. You might just end up replacing something like the tach cable. I don't
Yeah,
know if you can
it's-
adjust the instrument.
Well, so the instrument is adjustable,
Okay.
but probably not legally because it is an instrument and you have
can't
to take
open.
it apart.
Yeah.
And the way it comes apart, it's not like you take screws out and open it up and there's a nice little adjustment that says increase and decrease. It's a centrifugal
Paul,
thing.
are you going to admit to opening up an instrument in front
Well,
of
it was
Oh.
condemned.
everybody?
I
Condemned.
take instruments apart all the time. I don't reinstall them
I see.
after I've
Okay.
taken them apart.
Okay,
Yep.
well, I'm glad you clarified that.
But I will also say that if you should happen to run across someone that restores vintage Corvette tachometers,
Okay.
they might be the exact same instrument.
Really?
Oh, really?
We used
Oh.
to have, there was a guy here locally, and that was his business, was restoring old car instruments. And we, as an experiment, we took a couple of tachometers to him. Long story, how we figured out that they were the same. And he made some adjustments, and we put them in a couple of airplanes, and they were spot on. They were really good.
Oh.
Totally not legitimate to do. We were just finding out if we could, and it worked. I'm just saying it's out there.
So it is possible. But
For
if
an
you send
for experimental application, I suppose that would be allowed.
experimental
Yeah,
cardboard, yeah.
But I agree with Mike. It's time to let it go. But what was on that sitcom? Got one word for you: let it go.
Yeah.
I think a Horizon. Unfortunately, they're not in production anymore.
Oh,
So you-
Horizon isn't.
No, you'd have to get one
I thought you were
on
talking
eBay
about
or
a
something.
275. You're not talking about.
No.
digital.
Horizon is a company.
Oh,
the
okay.
P1000 have a digital tachometer. They are the most awesome thing. They'll give you the digital tach down to 1 RPM, which drove my dad nuts because it was always moving. So
Yeah.
you put a piece of tape over the last digit so you can't see it move. Works really good. But what it would also do, it counted RPM as opposed to measuring it, which is way more accurate. So it would count the pulses on the P leads. And every time the P lead or the magneto fires, you get this 100 to 200 volt pulse on a P lead, which is one reason why it has shielded wires on it. And it would count those pulses. So it'd be 3 pulses per on your 4-cylinder. So 2 pulses per revolution. And it would count those, and it could compare the left and the right magneto. So any failure of a mag is going to be a reduced number of pulses. It won't ever go faster. It always goes slower. So if it saw one of the 2 mags that was running slower, it would give you a yellow light or a red light to tell you that magneto had failed. So if you had a mag failure, you knew exactly which one it was.
Oh, that's slick.
Yeah.
So are you saying, Paul, that they're no longer available?
I have not been able to find them. I think they may have gone out of business. If someone knows better, please let me know.
That's a P1000.
P1000 by
Yeah.
Horizon.
Well, there are probably other electronic techs. I imagine Electronics International makes one.
They do.
If you put a JPI
We're not
in.
ready to go throwing all that sort of stuff in. We're still
understand. Yep.
getting our. We got an autopilot going in tomorrow, next week actually. The Aero Cruise, I think, is what Aero Cruise 100 now by somebody else. I'm an A&P. I did the mechanical, but I don't do the wiring. So I've got a shop that's going to put the wiring in hopefully tomorrow. So a shout out to Andy as well. So there you go. But anyway, if I got you on the horn for one more question, if that's permitted. We are running some cylinder head temperature issues. And I was just listening to one of your recordings. We just came out of annual. I have a friend of mine who's an A&P, and he does firewall forward. I do the firewall aft sort of thing because he's got the equipment actually that, of course we have to follow all the rules, and he has the knowledge and the equipment. I have the knowledge, but not the equipment, and of course the manuals. But we've been, I replaced the baffles, the flexible rubber baffles on the engine. And before that, cylinder number 2, which going back to the stuck valve story, was the replaced one, had been running kind of on the cool side. So cylinder number 2 is up in the front, left front. And that particular cylinder has been running hot compared to before. And I'm scratching my head and thinking, we'll check the timing, because I think you mentioned that in one of your earlier podcasts about double check the timing, make sure you got it just right.
But of course, that would affect all the
That
cylinders.
All of
affect
them.
all of them.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, this is just the one cylinder. Okay. So, all right. So
Anytime cylinder work gets done, and then there's a high CHT problem, one of the first things you want to look at is the inner cylinder baffles,
right.
Make sure they're installed.
which are
And-
very
correctly.
easy to not be
Miss
quite
or-
positioned right.
Yeah. Well, nothing changed underneath other than we took the lower cowl off and put it back on, which requires a lot of cussing and swearing.
But the
get that
inner
low
cylinder
caliber.
baffles have to come off
Right.
in order to replace the cylinder.
The
So
cylinders. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's been on there for 300 hours or so. So
Oh,
maybe that spring is given up the ghost finally,
could-
because
Oh, you're talking about the baffling wrapping around the front.
On
The
the-
intercylinder baffles are different. They're
They're-
between the two cylinders.
and on the bottom too, right? And there's kind
but
of
they're
right,
held
right.
on at the top.
Yeah,
okay.
it's where
Yeah.
you drop all your nuts when you're working on the engine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
familiar with that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, one of the
okay.
one of the things that we like to do is in a darkened hangar with the top cowl off, put a bright light underneath the engine, and then stand up on a ladder and look down.
Right.
And if you can see any light coming up,
Yeah.
you got a problem. You found
Right.
the problem.
Right. Right. Yeah. I hadn't thought about doing the light trick. Maybe that'll be the next step to give it a shot and see if we can
But if
find
it's
a
a single cylinder, Mike's saying it's most likely an airflow issue, not a
right.
timing or
Right.
Well, it can't
fuel
really be a
issue.
timing issue because that would affect
Right.
all the
Affect
cylinders.
Right.
everybody.
All of them
Yeah.
are doing good. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I'll take a look at the baffles and stuff. But like I said, I redid the rubber around the edges, and I was just like, how could it be different? Because I mean, I use the other ones for a pattern and put the notches in the right spot as
It
opposed to
just
the last
is.
guy.
I
Yeah.
did the same thing,
Oh, yeah.
Tim. My
Yeah.
cowl didn't fit right. I've had everything. All the heat
the other
moved around.
possibility, again, because the cylinder was replaced, is would be a leak in the intake tube, an induction leak.
And so to address that one, we would put maybe hook a vacuum with the blowing up. Let's see, intake. No, that wouldn't work.
Yeah, you
Well-
you can pressurize the intake manifold a little bit, and then go around
Right.
with soapy water and see.
Or
if it's
do
a
an
leak.
induction leak test.
One of my favorite checks. In-flight check, induction
Yeah.
leak test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
can-
walk
we-
me through that one. In-flight
I'll
induction
tell you
leak
what,
test.
we can send you the instructions for that. Tim.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Love to
I
have it.
have a note.
All right.
We'll make a note to do that.
One of the problems with, especially Lycoming, I don't know why Continental doesn't seem to do it, but on the Lycomings, the intake tube gaskets at the cylinder get hard and brittle and they will tear. Your induction system's always in a vacuum. It's never under
Right.
pressure. So you can, if you have a tear, that gasket can move and allow air to come in. But when you pressurize it and look for bubbles, that actually closes that little check valve you've
Yeah.
created,
Right.
and it may
Good
not
point.
leak. So what Colleen's talking about, the in-flight induction leak test is one of my favorite fun, cool
Yeah.
things to go do.
And Tim, do you know how to do a gammy lean test? You know what I'm talking about?
I'm familiar, but this is a carbureted engine.
Yeah,
I didn't
Right.
think
I
that
know
it-
there's some
Still a good test.
there's some misconception that gammy lean tests are only for
Well, it's
injected
because
engines.
GAMI sells injectors.
Yeah.
But
It's
that has
not
nothing to
just
do with
that.
it. The gammy lean test is
Yep.
simply a mixture sweep where you watch where each EGT peaks and you determine the fuel flow difference between the first cylinder to peak and the last cylinder
Okay.
to peak. And that's going to apply to any engine, whether it's carbureted or not, and it'll tell you whether there's a cylinder that's running leaner than the others. That winds up peaking first. The induction leak test basically is two gammy lean tests, one at wide open throttle and one at reduced throttle. Because if you have an induction leak, the induction leak's not going to matter at full throttle because the pressure inside the induction manifold and the pressure outside ambient are almost the same, and so
Right.
there's not going to be any flow through the leak. But if you do the test with the throttle retarded, say 10 inches of manifold pressure or something, then there's going to be a hurricane blowing through the leak if there is a leak, and the cylinder will wind up being a huge lean outlier at part throttle, but not a big lean outlier at full throttle, and that'll tell you that you have an induction leak. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Just to let you know, I have my engine monitor is the EI, which is just a non-recording stepping through each of the cylinders, both automatically and
so you'll have to do more work.
Oh yeah.
So you're the data recorder for your
yeah,
engine.
yeah, you're right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's going to be some effort.
Yeah.
Well, right after you replace the tach.
It's easy
There
to
you
spend
go.
somebody else's money is what
Yeah.
I mean. So,
There you go.
True.
Yeah, opium,
Mike's
other
good at
people's
that.
money.
yeah, that's right. There we go.
Opium.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for all your help, and I really enjoyed listening to your podcast. You keep it real, and I like seeing you guys at Oshkosh. I didn't make it this year, but maybe next year.
Well, we'll look for you next year, Tim. And
All right.
in the meantime, I will send you an email and point you to the website where those instructions are listed.
Perfect. And I'll look up the gaming lean test for a carbureted engine.
Yep.
There you go. That'll work.
Appreciate
Okay.
And I want your mustache guide.
Okay. It's just a DNA thing. That's
But,
all.
for those listening to the podcast on audio only, you will not get it. But
Yeah. That's
Tim has
pitch
a
for the video.
magnificent mustache.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Okay. Thanks,
Tim.
guys.
The next question is from Kevin, who has too much of a good thing. Go ahead, Kevin. We're not going to figure this one out.
Yeah, this is kind of a fun problem to look at once in a while. So I've got a Piper Cherokee 140, 1965, a nice simple airplane that just about anybody with a license and a wrench can fix. But a couple years ago, I moved to a new airport, and it was time for an annual. So I emailed 3 of the 4 shops on the field. I didn't realize there was a 4th one because they were associated with the flight school. But I emailed the 3 shops, and they all came back very quickly with 2 of them came back with very comparable prices. The third one it's a very large shop, so their prices were about double the other shop, but definitely they have a very good reputation. They work mostly on turbines and that type of thing. So I kind of flipped a coin and picked a shop and had great experiences with them. And then after I was there for a while, I had the opportunity to talk to a few more people, and I said, "Oh yeah, go talk to the other guy. He's really good too." So I went over there for an annual inspection. I had a great experience with him as well. So this brought up a couple of questions for me. Is when you have multiple good shops to work with, and they're all honest, they're all fully capable of fixing your plane. Is it better to have one mechanic who knows your plane well do all of your inspections? Or swap between the shops from time to time?
But the main thing is to don't tell anybody about this situation, because nobody lives in an airport with too many mechanics, and they're all going to come flooding in, and you're not going to be able to get on the schedule all of a sudden.
It's a great place to be.
Yeah, it was that was kind of one of the things that I was a little bit concerned about too, especially with all the other mechanics, all the shops all around the country getting so short. Are these guys going to be short on slots in the future?
Well, there are
now.
pros and cons to the question you're asking. It's a little complicated, but I've always been a big believer in getting different sets of eyes on the airplane. Different eyes see different things, and one IA will find problems that another IA overlooked, and not because he's sloppy, just because he has a different focus.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
the only disadvantage is if you take it to a different shop, they may feel like they need to go back to first principles on AD research and stuff, and it may cost a little bit more.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been doing my own annual for quite a while now since I got my IA, and I have to say, and there's probably a lot of people out there listening to this that are in the same situation. You get your IA and you're like, I know my plane better than anybody else. It would really benefit me to have Paul New, come to my shop and look at my plane. And I keep trying to get
Oh.
that. It's kind of like inviting someone
You
to
may
come
have to
in.
take it to him rather than the other way
Yeah.
around.
I mean, it's scary because you might be biting off more than you can chew. There might be a lot of work that's just lying there that I've been looking over. But I really think that if the same person looks at the airplane on a recurring basis, that you start to look past things that other people would flag. And that's probably a good thing to do occasionally.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
So I'm a
have
fan of mixing it up.
5 IAs at our shop. So we're kind of overqualified, but we rotate. I'm not allowed to do annual inspections anymore because I don't have the attention span. I'm thinking about business or whatever. So, but Steve and Doug and Blake and Rukong are very capable, and we'll swap them around. So we try not to have the same person do an annual and same airplane every year, and we'll find things that I don't want to say were missed the year before, but as Mike said, different focus, different life experience, depending on the model of airplane. And it doesn't mean that the previous mechanic wasn't good. It means that different people see different things. And that's a really
And
good thing.
And the inspection process is an imperfect process. That's
is.
why they make us do it every year.
Yeah.
But I got my airplane. It was amazing. We sometimes found discrepancies that obviously were there when the airplane rolled out of the Cessna factory.
Right.
And the airplane went through 10 annuals before the discrepancy was found. Something chafing, or something not properly protected or secured. Not huge things that would make you fall out of the sky, but it is kind of amazing how much gets missed during an annual.
I don't know that I would, from an interaction with your shops, I don't know that I would swap year to year, because pretty soon mechanics really like to know that you have a certain amount of loyalty because they've
Right.
invested in you,
Yeah,
and they've
exactly.
invested in learning your airplane. So, maybe use one guy for a period of time,
Yeah.
and then use the other guy. The big shop that likes to work on jets that doubled the price, I wouldn't
They don't want
waste
your business.
They don't want that. That's
Yeah.
the I don't want it price.
That's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So
That was the impression I got. They would have
Yeah.
done it, but they would have. They had
honor
better
that.
things to do. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
But,
letting no thanks.
The optimum situation is sort of the one that Paul described in his shop, where you can stay with the same shop, but you get a different IAs from year to year. That's really a good situation.
Yeah.
And I've had the opposite end of the spectrum too, where the mechanic, sees every little thing wrong and everything had to be fixed right now, or that airplane's gonna be grounded. And
Yeah.
that guy got fired after that annual. And I've heard a lot of advice on.
He used
that
the
thing.
right word. He fired him. Mike's
That's
trying
awesome.
to.
Well,
you are in charge.
We
Excellent.
love shops that find every little thing and write every little thing up and give us an 80-item discrepancy list. As long as they're willing to accept no for an answer on a bunch
Right.
of them,
Yeah.
But if IAs that consider everything an airworthiness item, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So that's the right attitude.
There you go. You're the
All right.
manager.
Yeah.
Take charge.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure, that was a great question.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Thanks for taking me.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
All right, so we've got a letter. You all remember we talked about burping the last time and all the gases that come out, and that generated a lot of feedback. And
Engines.
so,
We're
yeah,
talking engines. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Airplane engines.
I didn't think I need to clarify. Yeah. So this one from Chris I really liked. He said, "Hi guys, I really love the podcast, but I'm extremely confused now. In the last podcast I listened to, you discussed burping the engine of all the nasty gases in the case after flight by turning the prop backward with the oil filler cap removed. What?" he says. "I'm not saying that won't work. It sounds like it works great. My problem is that is 180 degrees opposite of what I've heard all three of you say about touching the prop after shutting down a flight. If you move the prop after flying, you scrape away the oil film in the cylinder walls, right? So what gives? Is it better to be gassy and slippery or burped and dry?
That's awesome.
I love it.
Wow, that's a good point. I I think he's
Well,
right. Yeah.
He is, but the question about the burping is not one that we said, oh, yes, you should do this. Someone called in and said, is it okay to take the cap off and let some of the steam out, which we all agreed with. And then he said, well, I've heard about turning the prop and it moves even more gas out. And we all agreed it does do that. And then we talked about be sure you turn backwards, because if you turn it forwards, you run the risk of, physical injury. So I don't know that we were, at least not intentionally condoning the act of turning the prop after shutting down, as much as we were saying, this is what's happening that's pushing the gases out.
But we should have taken that opportunity to note that you might not want to turn the prop
Yeah.
because of the lubrication in the cylinders. I know two separate people that have come up to me since that podcast and said, I tried it and it really does work. So
Yeah.
I think, and I tried it myself and it really does work. So
Sure.
I definitely think people are taking this advice and we need to caveat it.
Well, and I don't know, when you shut the engine down, it just got through running. And of course, you're turning it backwards. There's not new oil pressure coming on, but there is still oil if you have a Continental, there's still oil dripping on that camshaft. So within the first day or so, turning that prop is not going to be any real tragedy. And
It's-
everyone should be flying every week anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you scrape the walls and leave the vapors in there, then that's the worst of everything. But at least when you're scraping the walls clean of the cylinder walls, the vapor's releasing, so you don't have the water vapor in there to cause the corrosion. If you're going to go flying in the next week, it's probably no big deal at all.
Yeah, it's not at all.
Either way.
I think a dehydrator is probably a
much
better choice.
Much better way.
Yeah, just in general.
But
As
it
opposed
And they're
was-
not very expensive.
Yeah, but you have to hook it up. How do you?
Well, they're electric. Yeah. So if you're out tied down on the ramp or in a group hangar, it's probably not realistic,
Feasible,
I guess.
Well, you just need to have 115 volt outlet somewhere in
Yeah, but-
proximity to the airplane.
Yeah.
Do you
And an
put it
extension
just-
cord with your name on it.
I forget. Do you put it in the engine compartment or do you actually physically
No.
put something
Yeah.
into?
No,
Yeah.
it just has a hose that you connect to an appropriate place, breather or oil filler or whatever works best.
Okay, so you don't have to take a spark plug out, or you can just put it
No,
in your
no.
oil
Or
dipstick.
in the oil, the oil filler port or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Depending on your engine.
I've never had a dehydrator, but I
The
live
idea,
in
the
the
idea is
desert,
it
so-
just pushes a small volume of very
Dry
dry air into the engine, which displaces wet air, and then just keeps it dry for as long as it's running.
But I love that our listener was listening to us. and
Yeah.
called us out on this. Very good. He gets the points. He's right.
We're rewarding people for calling us out?
Yeah. Well,
Oh, man.
Uh-oh. You're in trouble,
Uh-oh.
Paul.
Dang.
very
Well,
good point.
the
My
situation
days on the podcast may be numbered.
the situation deserved clarification. So
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yes.
that's good.
Good luck.
That's a great segue to our next question from Thomas, who hopes we didn't steer him wrong. So now we got two in a row that are worried about being steered wrong. Go ahead, Thomas.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I listened to your July podcast, I think it was, and followed your tip that I open my oil filler cap on I fly Mooney, by the way, Mooney 252 with a TSIO 360 Continental engine. And after the next flight, I opened my oil filler cap to release the steam out of the engine. And not only that, but I turned the prop backwards, which I think you suggested, so that the engine is not able to start without purpose. So I did that. And when I came back to the airplane to fly it back home after a weekend trip, when I fired up the engine, my attitude indicator would not move. So I don't know if you're aware that we have a lot of IFR slots in Europe. So I had to make an immediate decision what to do if I shut the airplane down or if I could catch my slot. And it came to my mind that I have a standby vacuum pump, and I turned it on, and the attitude indicator came back to life. I left the standby vacuum pump on until I reached flight level 200, and then I switched it off, and everything worked fine. And after I landed, I talked to a friend about this, and he said, well, you should never turn the prop backwards because you might have killed your vacuum pump. And I did search the internet on that, and as far as I am able to interpret what I found, is that dry vacuum pumps might have a problem if the prop is turned backwards. So yeah, I came up with the question, if I just killed my vacuum pump, and I'm curious what you think about this. The good thing is the next time I fired up the engine, my attitude indicator came up immediately. So the next time everything worked fine, but I still have this question.
So the vacuum pump didn't die.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Obviously not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
dry
Well, by the
vacuum
way,
pumps fail catastrophically and never
Yeah.
come back.
They don't come
Yeah.
back from the dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I talked to my mechanic and he said, well, in former days, they usually didn't like to be turned backwards, but nowadays this shouldn't be a problem anymore.
I've heard that.
So
I've
Yeah,
also
I've
that.
heard this business about not turning dry vacuum pumps backwards for decades,
Yeah.
and I routinely turn them backwards, and I've never had
Yeah.
that precipitate a failure. So it may be an old wives' tale. I can sort of understand the logic because the blades in the airborne style pumps are canted a little bit, and so
I've heard they wear thin in one direction, like a knife edge. So if you turn
yeah
it the
they
opposite
get
way,
a
the edge
little
But
tail
Paul,
on them.
is that true, Paul? I mean, have you
Yeah,
ever heard that?
they wear at an angle. The thing is, and I have a pneumatic pump. I won't call it a vacuum pump because on some airplanes it's a vacuum and some airplanes it's
It
pressure.
blows. It doesn't suck, it blows.
But I'll take one when I do my Cessna classes, and I've been spinning it backwards for like 15 years, and it hasn't broken yet. And it was broken when I started. So, I mean, I haven't made it break more. But my theory is that if you turn the prop backwards and the vacuum pump fails, meaning one of the vanes has worn so far that it can get cocked at an angle and lodge in such a way that the pump can't rotate. And in that case, there's a nylon, we'll call it a fusible shaft between the pump and the engine. And 2 revolutions of the propeller is enough to twist that nylon shaft in half. And that prevents the pump from doing damage to the engine or loading the engine if the pump fails.
Mhm.
If you turn it backwards, one of these vanes gets cockeyed and locks the pump. What that tells me is it was worn slap out, and you should say thank you that it failed while you were turning the propeller instead of on the next flight.
What does worn slap out mean? Does that Tennessee?
It must be a Tennessee thing.
I lost you at the
Oh,
punchline.
sorry.
Paul.
Just worn out, excessively worn,
But
worn to its limits.
In his case, it's only 10 hours. He said he
Right,
had 10
and it
hours
didn't
on the
fail.
pump, and it didn't
Yeah,
fail.
it didn't fail.
So
It
what do
didn't
we
fail.
think? What happened? Why didn't it come up?
There could have
Can
been something else. It wasn't the pump, because the pump can't
what you
fail.
what you
and
might
not-
need to know.
Might have been the bearings in his gyro that was a little stubborn.
Sure,
to
yeah,
get
that's
started.
real common.
Well, I had my engine overhauled, so it's not only a new pump, but everything is a new setup.
Yeah.
And I might, if I am allowed to, I might have another question on that later.
Did we answer your first question?
So,
Anyway, you
So,
didn't kill your
yeah,
pump.
the vacuum. I obviously didn't kill my pump, but I didn't try to turn the prop backwards after that anymore. So I turn it forward now,
Yeah.
because
No,
I
no,
was,
no, no.
yeah.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm telling you.
it depends, Paul. It's only a don't do that if you have magnetos with impulse couplings.
Impulse couplings. And I don't know that you do or don't. Do you know if you have impulse couplings on your mags or if they're shower sparks?
I think I do have impulse coupling. Isn't
When
isn't
you-
that the
the
click
prop,
that you
do
hear
you-
when you turn the prop?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
I do
Please-
have it. Yeah.
Please,
Okay.
please don't turn the propeller in that
It's
direction.
dangerous.
It is dangerous. It's very dangerous. And it's
Okay.
immediate danger. Like if it fires because something's not right, and there's a whole slew of things. This is kind of this is my little sermon thing. I can't help but do it. They'll fire. People die every year because of this. And it'll fire. The blade swings around really rapidly. It happened to me about 6 months ago at the shop. And I just barely missed losing a hand because of it. So don't turn it forward. Just don't turn it. If you don't want to turn it backward, please don't turn it forward. Turning it backwards, maybe it fails a pump, but you have a backup pump. And soon as you start the engine, you'll know that the pump has failed. So there's no worries. And you should also have a vacuum gauge. You should have been able to look at that to tell if the pump was working.
Yeah, I do have a vacuum gauge, and I do have a light that comes on if
Right.
vacuum is too low. And that's my takeaway, that I have a backup system, and it's always a good opportunity to know the stuff you fly, to know the systems.
So
And
when you
that's
started,
a takeaway.
when you had this problem, did you notice the vacuum? Was the vacuum working when the
Well-
gyro was not erecting?
Well, actually, first I saw that the attitude indicator would not come to life. Then I took a look at the vacuum gauge, and it was low. I
But-
switched on the standby vacuum pump, and it went up.
Well, sure. So it was low because you were at a low RPM. Because the vacuum isn't going to come up until you're at 1,500 to 2,000 RPM.
Yeah.
If it's developing any pressure at all, the pump is doing its job.
I check it at run up.
I get your point, but usually the attitude indicator comes to life
Correct,
immediately
yeah.
after startup.
Yep.
Right. No. I'm not saying there wasn't something wrong. I'm saying as a troubleshooting tool to determine what the problem is. And so you force the gyro to start spinning. And Mike was talking about the bearings get a little stiff, or the little veins on the outlet of the casing, which directs the gyro so it erects itself. Sometimes they get a little stiff, and so you added enough pressure that it was able to start going. It was spinning before, it just didn't have enough pressure to make it spool up quickly and erect itself. You turned on the electric and got the pressure up higher, which you could have done by raising the engine RPM, which is, you don't want to do that while you're parked. What I'm saying is that the diagnostic process, yeah, I got it out, would be, the pump is working, the gyro is not working. So we've got a gyro issue, not a pump issue.
Okay, what you're saying is I should have my gyro checked.
No. I don't think there's anything you need to do to the gyro yet. I'm just letting you know that sometimes the parts of the gyro it's mechanical.
Yeah, I mean, you can
Sometimes the parts don't wanna move.
usually hear that after you shut the engine down and the gyros are just spinning down
Are
if they're
noisy.
noisy.
Yeah.
I one of the happiest days in my aircraft ownership career was when I ripped out the last mechanical gyro out of my Cessna 310 and put a couple of Garmin TI 275s in there, which are magical.
Yeah.
He
They
just
are.
overhauled an engine. Leave him
Thank you,
alone.
Colleen.
Yeah, that's-
I just wanted to say that.
I know.
That's right.
I'm with you. I've got mechanical.
We-
It's a question of
feel
budget,
your
you
pain.
know.
No,
Yeah.
there is nothing wrong here. Don't attack
But
anything. with
once again,
tools.
I think it's worth saying that contrary to what seems to be popular belief, we were not advocating turning the prop in either direction after shutdown.
Yeah.
Okay.
Paul was only saying if you turn the prop, make sure you
Right.
turn it backwards. But
Yes.
Okay. But what I did find out is exactly what you said. By turning the prop, you really push the steam out. You can
found that.
see it. Yeah.
It does work. Yeah. I know.
It does
it's
work.
Eye-opening. I tried it just on my last flight and I was amazed.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Well, that's a wrap on another podcast. What did we get right and what did we get wrong? We always love hearing from you. Please keep sending us those tricky questions and try to stump us. Your questions and comments can be emailed to podcasts@aopa.org. We hope to hear from you soon.
See ya.
Bye bye, everybody.